Get in, fellas. We're going back to therapy. Thanks for joining me again for our second session of the podcast. Really looking forward to some changes that we have coming this week and next week's in the weeks coming. So I wanted to give you a bit of those before we get started in today's show. So this week is the first time we have guests on to interview, which is great, different than you listening to me talk over phone recordings. Really excited for that. So I had a few of my lady friends on today to come teach us about the ladies' perspective on what we talked about last week. What are the men's main challenges with therapy and what are the things they'd like to see them working on, right? So we talk a lot about relationship dynamics, communication styles, things along those lines. So a few great interviews, 3 different people I had on. And in the week after that is going to be our first expert interview. And the topic is going to be on what you're going to hear a lot about today, which is about emotional expression. Okay. The format's going to be in each of these expert interviews that we're going to have an expert on, and we're also going to have a bro on. We're going to have a fella on to join us and, tell about their situation with the topic of the day, and then also to learn, be able to ask questions in a way that's different than I might ask an interviewer. So looking forward to having both sides here, a bro who's been therapized and one who might be a little further behind or not at all yet, right? So really looking forward to that example. In addition, today, we're going to see a new Hall of Fame inductee at the end of the episode. I'm going to keep that as a fun you'll see later. And then we're going to break down the tape of Welcome to Wrexham. I'll talk about that show when we get there, but if you've seen it, it's a great example of emotions and setting an example for emotions. So today's theme, boys, is that I have seen the future. I work with women. They are sick of us, all right? Maybe they've been too nice in your life to tell you how sick of you they are, but they are. And it's time. It's time for us to get better at this and to become the kinder, gentler bros that you're aiming to be if you're listening to this podcast. Because, boys, it's either that or you're never getting laid again. All right? So let's get it going. And take us to the intro, Richie. All right, fellas, at the start of the show, we're going to try something new, and we're just going to cover any topics that came up in this week of broness that don't make it into any of the bigger segments of the show, right? So if you're interested in getting something that you saw, you noticed onto the show, please, by all means, hit us up. Send, the email is gettingfellaspod@gmail. You know the Instagram at this point. Half of you have my phone number. So anything like that, please feel free to get my way, all right? And we'll, figure out a way to address it. We're going to start doing listener questions here soon enough and things like that. So if you're interested in something getting covered, ship it over. These topics this week: Bryson Dechambeau winning the U.S. Open. If anybody was watching that on Sunday, you saw an exuberant reaction from Bryson in a way that we don't often see golfers react, right? Golf may be considered the most milquetoast of any of the sports. That's changed with LIV and things like that. But Bryson, we know, is an emotional guy, spends a lot of time on the internet creating content. I thought his reaction was awesome. Not everybody did, but a little whatever, new school, old school. If you didn't see it, he was really energetic, really pumped up, doing a lot of bro hugging. It was just really nice to see. So it was not subdued like you might think golf is. So I just want to shout that out because I thought it was really cool. And then also shout out the Celtics for winning the title. Just might as well say it because it's like half a sports podcast. They all seem pretty emotionally appropriate celebrating. I haven't seen anything that exciting. So maybe in the coming days we will. But congrats to the Celtics. I wholeheartedly wish it wasn't them. But what are you going to do? All right, so then we'll switch into the breaking down the tape this week with Welcome to Wrexham. All right, and we're back for another week of breaking down the tape. As I mentioned in the intro, excited to honor this week 2 really titans of the current bromotional game, Rob McElhenney and Ryan Reynolds, who are the producers and stars of the television show on FX on Hulu called Welcome to Wrexham. It's a great documentary series about Rob and Ryan, from famed of It's Always Sunny and Deadpool, who bought a British soccer team in Wrexham, which is in Wales, and really just worked to build the team back up to its former glory. It touches a lot on the town itself. And both Rob and Ryan share a lot about their own childhoods, their own emotional processes, as do the players, fans. It's just a really great documentary if you haven't watched. So this new season is out now and coming out now. So we're actually going to jump into the 3rd episode. And there's going to be 2 points we touch on here. One is actually jumping in with a bunch of fans who have their own men's group therapy. sessions that they go to, and another brings on a sports psychologist to work with the player. So I'm going to talk about each of those points.
I'm Dan Rowe from Andy's Man Club.
Yeah, Dan, boys. All good?
Yeah.
Good to see you. Yeah. How you doing, pal?
Andy's Man Club are a men's peer support group. We support men's mental health and suicide prevention. The idea was come along, have a brew, have a biscuit, and have a chat.
Have a
I
chat.
couldn't conceive
Love
a
having
world in
chat.
which people talked about how they felt as a bloke.
Yeah.
When I came for the first month, I cried just because I couldn't articulate why I was struggling so much.
But this is exactly the room to say, no, I'm having a shocker. I'm really low and I'm barely hanging on.
I'm guessing the honesty from other people in the circle probably will coax it out of me a little bit more with a bit of luck. You find sometimes just listening is enough.
Really cool, right? I mean, the idea of men doing group therapy is pretty foreign here in the States, outside of Alcoholics Anonymous and other A's, and then also military stuff.
Going well.
And so I think it's really cool to see these men in a culture like the United Kingdom, where depression is a major problem, and also them being willing to hit it head on. That you heard a few things that we've talked about here, which is one man being surprised that he cried and he was struggling literally just to articulate how he'd been feeling, right? And that, these men really come together to support each other. So would love to see more of this in the States, and especially amongst our groups of bro-y sports fans, right? So this next part is a sports psychologist comes on to work with the players.
What a save. My name is Sam Katadia, and I'm the first team sports psychologist for Wrexham. Well, I've worked with Phil Parkins for about 20 years, helping players understand their minds better. Because if we got a better handle on how our minds work, we're going to bring, a better performance on match days. Sitting in fourth, it's really important that we're on top of our game.
As soon as you make a mistake and your mind starts working again, all that happens is you end up making another mistake and another mistake.
If I'm constantly in my head, I'm wasting energy. When a player's mind is less busy, they're going to bring more mental strength, more freedom, more energy, more dynamism to the table. Is about not second guessing yourself or thinking like you're doing something wrong. Look in your direct experience when you've had your best games. And I bet you haven't been willpowering and saying, come on, I got this. You've potentially just
free almost.
Free. Yeah. Freedom. My approach.
Love the term free there at the end, right? So, you heard a lot of good things there too, and things that can be maybe a less scary version of thinking about therapy, which is I need to have a free mind. I need to not doubt myself. I need to be confident, right? Because it's all pretty natural for us as people to second guess ourselves, for us to have hesitations, for us to maybe get in our own heads after we haven't performed as well, right? And the truth is that in order to be your best at your job, the best in your relationships, the best as you're a parent, you need to be able to have good control over those things, to be able to challenge the negative thoughts that come, and understand our patterns to perform at your best. So really, really great job. It's not surprising. Welcome to Wrexham is a really great show as far as its emotional attunement at the intersection of mental health and sports. And really would recommend it to anybody. So let's thank you again, Rob, Ryan, and all the guys at Andy's Man Club, and Richie. So we're going to hit each week as we break down the film with the DAP. All right. Good stuff. So when we get back from the break, we're going to have our main segment, bringing on a handful of ladies to talk about their experience with men and what they'd like to see them doing better. Quickly joined by a good friend of mine. Her name's Kristin Grimes. And Kristin's a great guest for us to have on, not only because we have a history together, but because she's doing active work in this community that'll benefit men as well. So you can find Kristin on Instagram. Her handle's below, where her goal is to be bringing awareness and dismantling diet culture. The plan is to have Kristin on for us to talk about some of the myths that men fall into, as a full episode in terms of diet and nutrition culture. So we'll get there. But right now, she's just a woman. She's experienced men. She's married to one. He can be a pill like anybody. So I asked Kristin to come on and talk a little bit about men with me. So Kristin and I actually worked together here in Denver, and we did eating disorder treatment at a residential level, which means the kids sleep there with kids and teenagers. So her and I have done a lot of work together, seen a lot of stuff. And it's just really nice that she was willing to come on tonight. So thanks, Kristin.
Thank you. I'm so pumped to be here.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I look forward to when we get to really dive into some of your nutrition content as well. So Kristin, just starting off with really generally, like, what experience have you had with men that have frustrated you over time, and what would you want them to be working on?
Good question. The first thing that comes to mind, because I think it's the most common, and it's not just men that fall into this, but I think stereotypically it is more so men. And that is jumping to fixing problems and trying to have a solution to an issue rather than work through it. It's like, like bypassing all of the discussion or communication or whatever needs to happen and just being like, well, just tell me what to fix. What can I do? What can I fix? And I personally don't love that. Because I can fix things on my own. That is probably what stands out to me the most. And I've seen that in different generations of men in my life as well.
Sure. Kristin, we saw this a lot, right? With our kids and teenagers, that parents who mean very well, and this is for anyone in this audience who's a parent or in their own relationships, right? Work or romantic otherwise. It's invalidating to somebody's emotional experience when they come to you with a problem and you try to fix it, right? Most often, if we want our kids to feel empowered, if we want our partners or coworkers, et cetera, to feel empowered, we want them to feel competent, right, Kristin? So I think what you're experiencing is you might want to come and vent to a man in your life, and he immediately can't. Sometimes the men can't tolerate the negative emotions. That's generally the core of this problem you're bringing up. And they just are like, cool, my role is to fix. That's what I do. That's what I am. So I think it's a really fair point because it feels shitty, right? Like, I think any man even listening to this podcast, right, even though this is something we tend to do, Kristin made a good point. This isn't, and none of these issues are unilateral, right, on one side. And you can imagine what that feels like. You just want to come to your buddy and complain, and they immediately start to, like, tell you what to do, or did you think about this? And it's just like, screw you, man. I'm just trying to have a beer. You know,
it's classic mansplaining, right?
Mansplaining, sure.
I have the answer. Let me just tell you.
Right. It's like, bitch, I got Google. I know the answer. I can figure it out. Just sit here. So I think it's a great example, Kristin. I think that's just the way it is and the way it was.
Yeah, I am curious because I think this all ties into you're speaking to, like, the kind of that developmental age, right? When, like, young, 6, 7, 8. From my experience, I don't know if you have the same one, but women are taught to hold the feelings, feel the feelings. Men are taught to hide them. And if there's an issue, you solve the issue. And then next time the issue happens, you fix it, right? So back to that theme of fixing. And I was reading something earlier that said women tend to be more often diagnosed with things like depression, anxiety, things that are that more emotional diagnosis, whereas men are more likely to be diagnosed with, like, antisocial personality disorder or not bipolar, but those more like behavioral.
ADHD. So I think the theme you're going for is internalizing versus externalizing disorders. Which is a little different, right? Internalizing things are more like we take the punishment out on ourselves or the blame comes to ourselves. And women, unfortunately, in this culture do get hardwired to internalize things, right? They hold the burden, right? The whole family's emotional burden. A lot, women we know apologize for everything, right? Whatever it is in our society, it automatically makes them, right, feeling like they have to, it's on them. Men get taught confidence, pride, whatever, and it's everybody else's problem, right? It's externalized problems. So little boys get ADHD, little girls don't have that, right? Which we know isn't true, right? But it's just kind of those things. Yeah. But it's if you think again about men and intimacy and love, we're not rewarded for showing feelings, right? And maybe now, maybe in this coming generation or as we go, but generally, right, it's rage on the football field. It's, confidence and walking tall. Those things are all rewarded. There's really no path for men to be rewarded for naming their feelings and being emotionally vulnerable. So some of that stuff's changing. In this episode, Kristin, in the Breaking Down the Tape segment, we talk about an episode of Welcome to Wrexham, which is a great example of a show that intersects with feelings and emotions. Ted Lasso, right? Like these kinds of ideas that are bringing, the intersection of feelings and bro culture together. You're right. It's and I don't want to say patriarchy too much because people's ears start burning, but like it is what it is, right? It's the culture that we're in. And to think that we're much farther past that than we were 50 years ago, it's probably untrue. Not as far as we'd like to be anyway.
Yeah, I'm interested to see with the things like what you are doing here, how those paths change, because I do think that that's such a common, I think it's a problem. Like, I think we need to have those reward systems for men and women equally, just in the way it goes both ways.
It would be, I think for me, it'd be reframing leadership, right? Because we've had an expectation of what a good leader is, and that's always been through a male lens. And again, women have been in the workplace, right, increasing power over decades, which is great. But I still think the definition of who gets to be a leader amongst women is still based on a male definition of leadership. And so, again, direct communication, not taking shit, being a bad bitch, whatever it is, right? These are still the terms we use versus like being a good listener, being empathetic, being open-minded, right? These traits that we would probably associate with femininity. Probably makes you the CEO of a nonprofit, which is great, but it doesn't make you the CEO of Chase Bank. And so that is just kind of my thoughts on that, right? So we'll see. I would like to believe, and that's my whole theme on this podcast, is that we would all stand to be better friends, co-workers, partners, romantically, etc., based on having these skills. So I think the data will be out there as we go.
Yeah.
Appreciate your thoughtfulness on it.
Yeah.
Kristin coming to us from the confines of a happy marriage. And there we go. So I'm curious, Kristin, thinking about men in general, the challenges that you have in communication with your husband.
We have had a lot of learning about how to communicate in, 2024? So 11 years we've been together.
I was going to bring up actually that you and Mac are an interesting example because you were together so young and got married, right? You met in high school. Right. So it's really interesting because the growth has to be within the relationship, right? Versus people who don't get married till later, or they break up with their high school sweetheart.
Yeah, it was not without struggle, for sure. Naturally. I was 17 when we started dating. I think we both were 17. And so, of course, we're young, we're children. And then going through college, and at one point, being long distance. So in that way, like, communication was very important. So, like, and I, both in that way and also in our, like, verbal communication, I am such an outward processor that I just say everything and I process as it comes out of my mouth. And he is not that way. He is very thoughtful and I'm going to think through all of the scenarios in my head before I say something. And so that's always been kind of a pain point because I want to have a conversation and my way of having a conversation is just like word vomit.
Yeah.
And he is trying to then take in all of that and process it. And usually that ends in him being very silent for a period of time, which is then frustrating to me because then I'm like, are you not listening to me? Like, did you not hear me?
I always have an active brainstorming session going on, and he is the kind of guy who likes you to do that ahead of the meeting. You show up to the meeting with your notes. You've already had your thoughts. We don't need to be brainstorming.
Yeah. So that's really hard. And then that oftentimes turns into, with my frustration, I'll like ask questions trying to get something and he is like, well, now you're not actually asking questions because you want the answer. You're just asking questions because you're mad. And I'm like, no, I'm mad because you won't answer my questions. So we end up in this like circle. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge is just I have the awareness now, and I think we've learned that about each other, that, okay, Kristin's just going to like blabber on over here and yap, and Mac is going to take 5 to 10 business days to evaluate and then get back to me. But like we've learned that. And so I don't always do a great job, and he doesn't always do a great job, like, in the moment.
Yeah, Kristin, I think you're pointing out what often brings people into couples therapy. And funny you brought that up, right? Like, is just those differences in style, right? I think people assume couples therapy must mean you're on the verge of divorce, or must mean that you have major problems like abuse or something along those lines, when really most of the couples therapists are excellent just navigators of communication and dynamic, right? I've done a little bit of it, but I'm not a pro. And it just comes down to understanding each other, right? That would require that everybody be vulnerable enough to share their style and what's hard and what they're good and not good at in terms of communication. But just thinking about that, right? And I'm putting that out there to all the men listening today. Kristin bringing up like, hey, I've been married 10 years and like, this is still a problem, right? And so, which is what it is, right? Not a huge deal, but it might be something for you to think about with your partner, the you listener, right? Of, would we benefit from communicating better, to learn each other's styles and have a safe space to come up with new strategies for when we're struggling or when we're communicating in conflict? Because I'll tell you what, you save yourself a lot of headache, a lot of frustration, a lot of big feelings that probably don't need to be had. So that's my pub for couples therapy in general. But I'll tell you what, Kristin, you've given me an episode idea of having somebody who does couples work on, and learning from them and how that might be. So love to hear it. Kristin, thank you for your time again. I look forward to having you on again and talking more about diet culture and specifically men. I think that's just throwing it out there as probably something that we equate to women, right? Diet culture. But Kristin was bringing up the Liver King, who we know well, right? And guys like that who are out there throwing a bunch of nonsense out in the world. So look forward to talking more, and thank you sincerely for your time.
Thank you for having me. Good luck with the future episodes.
Thanks, friends. Welcome back. I'm again blessed to be joined by a good friend of mine, Maddie Abrams. She is a speech and language pathologist, and she works specifically with kids who struggle with verbal communication. So, Maddie, you can speak on this, but kids who might be on the spectrum, kids who have other sorts of expressive disorders. So I thought how apt to have a woman come on the podcast whose job it is to teach people how to speak and communicate, to talk about speech and communication, especially from the men. So, Maddie, thanks for joining us. Feel free to take the mic. What do you feel like is important from your perspective, thinking about therapy, emotions, your experience with them?
Yeah, I think just being able to communicate clearly, and I, as a speech therapist, see how frustrating it can be for anyone of all ages to struggle with communication. It can be incredibly frustrating.
It's interesting, Maddie, just when you said that, it made me think of how communication patterns are really developed super young, right? And you're working mostly with kids, but it probably feels like for any of us when we're struggling to communicate, I know I can speak for myself, certainly, that it feels like we're young. It feels like we're back in those spots from when we're younger. The term I might use would be like regressing us, right? And so just that idea that, we would think that as we get older, the communication gets easier, but I don't really find that to be true at all, either from personal or professional experience.
Absolutely agreed with that. Well said.
In your experience, particularly in your, I'm asking the women I have on to comment on their romantic relationships, because I think that'll be what speak most to men, but really anywhere you want. Do you feel like you've had experiences where, your romantic partners have struggled, and what would you say about it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've definitely had experiences there. I would say, a great source of frustration could be just communicating directly, and either at the time of maybe some kind of mishap, some kind of miscommunication to express feelings, or shortly after, maybe the next day or so, following up, rather than letting emotions bottle up, potentially exploding later.
Burying issues. Yeah. And we're gonna work on some of that stuff, Maddie, that you hit on. So what I heard there was emotional expression being a challenge for men, right? I touched on this with Kristin too. Like, we're not really rewarded or incentivized for communicating clearly our emotions, and especially the negative ones. And really really the thought of this thing happened. We're all going to take a step back and come back to it later that night or the next day and talk about what happened, rehash it, break it down. Severely not taught. Right. And so I do think, and I hope, you're working with kids and families, as do I, that we work on that better. Right. Because that's a very simple thing that I think that kids are not taught by their parents, which is it's okay. We had this fight. We don't need to do it right now, but we are going to come back and talk about this. And for whatever reason, that just gets lost in romantic relationships too. I'd say for the majority of people.
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely something I find in my line of work where I will revisit with kids, especially some older kids, just reflecting back on what happened today and how did you feel in that moment? How do you feel now speaking about it? So I find myself having some parallels there between my job and partnership romantically.
Yeah, it's wild, Maddie. I mean, I thank you. I know you've watched the first episode, right? And part of what I talked about to start this podcast is like, we can all learn this stuff. The concept of what happened, how did it make me feel? What did I do next? What would I do better the next time? Right? It's very straightforward. We all have the ability to learn that and practice it. And just like you're hearing from us, and if you're listening to this, you probably know this yourself. Like, you didn't learn how to do that anywhere. Right. And I feel like kind of just that practice is straightforward enough. We just have to be vulnerable enough to talk about it and admit mistakes and hear other people's side. Maddie, what do you think as far as like the way that those challenges in communication have impacted you in your relationships? You can't speak for all women, but I'd imagine that you've experienced things that others have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that comes up for me in relationships that a lot of my female friends have agreed on frustrations around have been carrying that mental load.
It's so funny, Maddie. I've heard these contrasting points that I think over time will flush out, right? That some women are really frustrated that their men overcompensate decision-making and don't want to hear their opinion. And other times in relationships, we built this like codependent pattern where men become more helpless, right? And I think those are differences just in men's style and how they're brought up. And hell, even the most complicated people fluctuate back and forth between those two poles, right? But just hearing you say, and you see this all the time, couples who really just can't seem to function without each other, guys get in relationships because their mom used to take care of them and wipe their behind until way too many years into their development. And they just kind of see that as the role of women, right? Like you said, and we'll emphasize she's referring to an ex boyfriend here because her current boyfriend is the producer of the show. Thanks, Maddie. I just, hadn't put that on anybody yet. She's dating Richie, not Rambo, just if anyone was curious. I think it's interesting, right? That I get some women who tell me their partners would never let them make a decision, which is one type of way, and another who the men can't make any decisions.
Yeah, I think decision fatigue is real as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're just sometimes
tell me about decision fatigue. I haven't heard that term too much.
Yeah, where one partner just gets sick of making all the decisions. So that could be either side, woman, man, whatnot. But yeah, just I don't want to always decide what we're having, where we're going, etc. But at the same time, when you step up, I want you to fully step up.
Yeah, and I think what might sound conflicting, Maddie, if you have any thoughts on this, right, is how can a guy, the audience I'm trying to speak to are good guys who just haven't learned this stuff, right? None of us want to be controlling of our partners or anything like that. How can we strike the balance of like, I would like to hear out my woman and her opinions and those things without, and then also the balance of like, sometimes I'd like you to make the decisions. Like, do you have any feelings on how to strike that balance?
Yeah. I would say it pretty similar to that is sometimes it's really nice when you make the decisions, especially maybe you can give examples of when I don't feel strongly about something, please step in. Let's not go back and forth so much, especially if it's been a long day at work or something. Like, let's just jump into it and let's role reverse. Sometimes you take the lead, sometimes I take the lead. But I think communicating that really directly, this is what I like, can go
role reverse. Maddie, you feel like these people have gone to couples therapy and they're going to know what you're talking about with role reverse. But I do think it's probably something we can all wrap our heads around, And I think what I heard there too is communicating, right? Like ahead of time, understanding someone's point of view, right? Like for your partner to know, okay, these are my tough days at work, right? So I'm going to be the one who does it these nights versus others. Like, these are all things we can do. And yet I still feel like all arguments come back to like, what's for dinner, right? As like the old adage, the old joke goes. So when it really does just take a little bit of thoughtfulness ahead of time, and we'll touch on this over and over again, you have to do the work ahead of time to avoid much, much, much more difficult situations, right? So planning that kind of stuff out, communicating ahead of time will save you a lot of frustration. Efficient, whatever kind of manly words we want to throw in there, it could be more efficient. It saves you the trouble. Blah, blah, happy wife, happy life, something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Or you could even circle back to what we were talking about earlier. And if there is a breakdown with this and you're getting frustrated, one partner or both, just coming together quickly after it happens the first time instead of waiting till it happens over and over.
Do you have a feeling like in the past, you touched on emotional expression. Are there any other things that like have stopped that type of reconciliation or those types of rehash sessions from happening?
Maybe not having the emotional vocabulary or knowing what kind of questions to ask.
Yeah, maybe it's hard for men to know what kind of questions to ask in order to build empathy or to understand somebody. It's not a muscle they flex very often. Yeah, emotional expression being language and those kinds of things. I can speak from experience, right? Within conflict with other men, a lot of times the go-to is just, it's not a big deal. We don't need to talk about it, right? Which is terrible, frankly, right? Like you said, the feelings build up. The only emotion we know as men is anger, right? If you have a conflict to resolve and somebody says to you, it's not a big deal, we don't need to talk about it, you better believe that other person still is going to want to talk about it, right? So I hear you there. Just kind of the men's strategy. Maybe that's what it was like in their household growing up, right? Just like, bad thing happened, we just don't talk about it. It's cool. We're all whatever. Which I'd imagine in both directions, men, women, relationships in general, just be hella frustrating.
Exactly. That can be another fatigue that tends to fall on women, is that they are the ones bringing up often what kind of breakdowns we're having in a relationship. So whether it's usually related to communication, but whether it's communication or what have you, always having to bring that up as a woman is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, right. And it's unfair, frankly, right? I think anybody listening to this can hear this, and I don't care how you were raised or what kind of manly man you think you are, right? Like, it's not fair. You wouldn't want to do it. They shouldn't have to do it, right? Parenting, this comes up all the time. What are the roles of parents in a relationship, right? And I would hope that our generation, the younger generation, are pushing up against those things, right? So that's all we can hope for.
Absolutely. It's exciting to see.
Yeah. Well, Maddie, great to see you as always. I'll see you this weekend, as we always do, and looking forward to some good times ahead. And thanks for joining. I really appreciate it, and it's been a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. Thanks, Stephen.
I got another guest here today. It's been so nice to have this many of my female friends step up and want to join the cause here of helping us grow into better and kinder, gentler bros. So welcome on, a close friend of mine, Shannon. I met Shannon here in Denver. We did residency together at the University of Colorado. And also the reason we became so close is Shannon's a fellow Buckeye. So Shannon, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
There we go. So, Shan, the general theme I'm asking for everybody is what's your experience been like with men in terms of communication or things that have frustrated you over time in your life with men?
Or lack of communication. Going back to when I was dating, like in my early 20s, there were often things that happened where the lack of communication or just being ghosted or stuff like that would make me feel really crappy, like it was my fault. And that was something that I kind of gradually got better at, being like, okay, this isn't me, this is them. But at the time it was really challenging. And as I've, gone through training in psychiatry, and actually now I'm in private practice and I work with a lot of men, I've kind of come to the realization that, wow, like it never was about them not caring. It never was about that they didn't like me or that um, that I did something wrong. It actually was just, I don't think that they really knew how to communicate their feelings. Maybe there was just a lack of emotional words to use or a deeper understanding of like how they were feeling. And so they just kind of sometimes can shut down. And, a lot of men that come into my office will be talking and they'll be sharing things with me. And as I'm like probing questions and stuff, and then I will ask, hey, have you talked? Have you shared this with your girlfriend, with your fiance, with your wife, with the women in your life, right? That you're having this struggle with. And it's no. I'm like, oh,
obviously.
okay. Yeah.
What would they be coming to see you for otherwise? Yeah, Shan, you bring up like a lot of good points, right? And I'm sure we're going to get into on this podcast dating and the concept of ghosting in general, right? I've been there, having been single and obviously as you have. And man, I want you to hear this, right? You've probably been ghosted. You have been and you've done the ghosting, right? And I can say from both personal experience on both ends of that is that, and Shannon points it out, you're going to leave somebody's emotions out there. And I don't feel like anybody listening to this wants to be hurting somebody. And it's hard, right? When we have challenges and we don't mean to be hurting somebody else, but our own difficulties spread that around, right? So you're leaving somebody on the hook with, what did I do wrong? What's going on here? Making somebody feel crazy. And we've all felt that way. And it's a really uncomfortable feeling, right? Yeah. So I think Shannon's point being like, we can say hard things. It just takes practice and obviously not doing it sets us up for more challenges.
And I feel like I should be clear that women do this too, or non-binary people too, right? Like this is kind of a human thing, but I would say that there's a trend with it a little bit more.
Ghosting goes in both directions. Yeah, I think the ghosting certainly goes in both directions. I think the more, dating content anyone here takes in, or again, personal experience, right? So yeah, and that's the idea here. Emotional expression just really generally, especially of negative emotions, tends to be a male dominant trait. But to say that poor communication can't go both ways is definitely untrue. All right, Shannon, I think another interesting perspective you brought up is your time as a clinician now. Shannon's a practicing psychiatrist up in Bozeman, Montana. And so, Shannon, tell us what, especially in an area like Montana, really under-resourced and the general idea of cowboys don't go to therapy, what tends to bring men in to see you? Who decides, and how do they end up in your room, in your office?
Most of the time, I'm looking at kind of depression, anxiety, things like that.
Yeah, the baseline stuff we're looking to touch on here.
Yeah, surprisingly, my experience has been that men come on their own. Like it's not their girlfriend's pushing them. It's not somebody else pushing them. It's actually them looking within themselves of like, I don't know what's going on and I need some help. And I don't know who to talk to. And maybe a psychiatrist would be a good person, right? And so I think like from that perspective of, okay, well, they're doing it on their own, which like that takes a lot of courage and strength. And the other trend that I see though is they're pretty isolated because they don't feel like they can talk to all the people in their life. That's not true for everybody, of course, but oftentimes I'm the first one that they're telling about some of their like deepest, darkest secrets or struggles. And I think I'm really trying to help them gain that sort of community of like, you're not alone. But I see a ton of men who are going through the same thing.
You hit the nail on the head too of the men who are going to end up seeing you are the ones who don't have support in other ways. Again, whether that be uncomfortable from their own experience, going to the women in their lives, or that there is no path to be discussing these things with the men in their lives, right? And so you also brought up it's a self-selective population that you're seeing, right? If they show up on their own, they're going to be probably a little more open, vulnerable, advanced in this than somebody who would never show up or never consider seeking therapy out.
It's a college town. I see like a lot of student mental health too, because I'm like right on MSU's campus.
Are there any like trends of things you're seeing with that younger population? You know, I'm hoping to really grab, population that age, college age and up into the 30s. Do you think you're noticing like certain themes or certain things?
Well, I call it TikTok University, and everybody thinking that they have ADHD and autism.
Sure.
Especially in like my younger population right now, who has gone through a pandemic and has really struggled with like isolation and then coming back. And I think I see a trend of like a lot of really severe social anxiety that then people are like misinterpreting for autism.
Yep.
That's a trend. Woof. It's a hard one. Or just like, but TikTok says X, Y, and Z. And I know you're going to do a great job putting great information.
Hey, that's part of what I'm hoping to do is just put out good information out into the world for the young people. I think you bring up a good point, Shannon, and this is what I work on. And if we have anybody in this audience that's resonating with that of like, oh, I want to go and ask if I have autism or ADHD. I don't necessarily want to feel weird or bad doing so, right? Is that I ask my people I work with to tell me functionally what's going on and what are their difficulties, right? Mm-hmm. So as opposed to wanting to place a diagnosis or a label on yourself, right? It's like, what am I struggling with? And most of my patients, when I see them, can do that, which is great, right? Like, okay, but they haven't like thought to frame it like that. Like, yes, I struggle with organization. I can't track a conversation. I am cripplingly anxious to get out into the world and do something socially. I do struggle with eye contact. I don't understand other people's experiences, right? And so those would be some of the symptoms of ADHD versus autism. And Shannon really hit a good point for our 20-somethings in the crowd is where did COVID play a role in isolation and impacting their social skills and their development in that way. So I think that's pretty obvious what, COVID has done to early 20-somethings, as well as just the march of technology in general, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of good information on that. If you have, the courage to get on Netflix and watch The Social Dilemma, I think it's a really good documentary about what social media has done to our brains. It's obviously terrifying. Even as somebody who knows all the research they're presenting, I had to pause it every 20 minutes and be like, shit, this fucked me up. So, but it is really true, right? I think when we're working with younger people, we're noticing both what COVID and social media stuff has done to development. Shan, in your practice and just in life in general, what have you thought about men's ability to learn the skills that we're trying to touch on and the things you're trying to teach them?
They're fully capable. Like growth, I've seen the change, and pretty quickly too. Like in clinical practice, I have seen significant growth and change in their ability and capability. And yeah, I think they always come back and are like, thank you.
Yeah.
Then
I hear that, boys.
You did it. You swam. You did the swimming. You did the work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really good. It kind of points out what I brought up a few times now, Shannon, which is we believe in you as therapists, right? If that's how you want to see it, as people who've done this work, both Shannon and I, right? We know that men are capable. We have full and utter faith. It just, you have to start, you have to practice, you have to do these things and learn, just like anything else you would learn. And that it's not a lost cause for anybody, right? It's just what our culture's told us and what our experiences have been that say we're not capable of these things. It's scary to get started. I hear that a lot from men. And we see it works. Shannon and I both work with military veterans. We work with younger people and high schoolers. We've worked all the way up through, older ages, right? This is possible and nothing's stopping you except from getting started. So Shannon, thanks for let's ending it on a positive note. Appreciate your time coming in and can't wait to get up to the Gallatin Gateway for some beautiful time this summer.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Thanks, Dr. Solomon.
Peace. All right, fellas, we're back to induct our second member of the Bro Motions Hall of Fame. And if you've been looking at this cover art and you've been thinking, okay, I recognize that host, he's whatever looking, I know Rambo, right? Who are these other two older looking gentlemen, right? I've had people think the guy in the red sweater is JFK. Other presidential names have been thrown out to me, but guys, it's a red sweater. We know who that is. And our second inductee is the Reverend Fred McFeely Rogers, known to all of us as Mr. Rogers. So I'll point out that not all of our guests are going to be joining us from the afterlife or all our inductees, but much like when you start a sports hall of fame for a team, you're going to have the oldest players who deserve to be honored first, right? So I want to make sure we're touching and shouting out really the OGs of Bromotions, right? So what do we know about Mr. Rogers? He was born outside of Pittsburgh. And as a kid, he really struggled, right? We talked about that with Bill, and maybe there's a theme, right, in terms of emotional attunement and having your own struggles as a kid. Mr. Rogers really struggled with bullying and loneliness in his childhood, as well as medically. And this was early on in the 20s and 30s. He had some severe asthma attacks and some serious scares to his health. Through high school, his skills and social skills improved, and as did his confidence. He went on to major in divinity, hence the good reverend, and music in school. The show that we all know and love Mr. Rogers for, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, debuted in 1968. It was revolutionary in its time as the first show to speak directly to children about their social and emotional needs. Before this, it was all kind of kids in play. Mr. Rogers came out, Sesame Street came out, and all of a sudden we thought about the fact that kids have emotional needs and they deserve to be addressed in a public space like this. So Mr. Rogers himself carried that show on his back, as we know, wrote and edited all the episodes, played the piano, sang the songs, created the characters, did the puppets, right? And most importantly, spoke to all of us as humans. Kind is what he expressed, right? Being kind and treating our neighbors, whether they be our actual neighbors or our neighbors out in this human world, with love and respect. So, Mr. Rogers, and again, times where we didn't talk a lot about feelings in the 70s into the 80s, where this show continued to be successful into the 2000s, brought up topics about death of family pets, sibling rivalries, having a new sibling be born, switching schools, your parents getting divorced, right? These were not things that were regularly being discussed, let alone from the eyes of a child on television or in other media in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So we really owe a lot to Mr. Rogers, as we all know, for helping us learn to speak openly about difficult issues in a time where that was really not a strength of humanity, especially not men, as we're learning here on this podcast. So thank you, Reverend, for setting the stage for these future generations to improve their skills in kindness and empathy. We look to build on those steps in the future here on this podcast and as men out in this world. And we'll always remember to be kind to our neighbors. All right, y'all. Thanks for joining for another episode of Get In, Fellas. Again, I want to say thank you to all my friends who were able to come and support the podcast. Maddie, Kristin, you can find her content at Kristin Grimes RDN on Instagram, and Shannon. I want to say thank you. We are using the theme music from Otis McDonald. The song is called Ever Felt Part 1. He's got a lot of bangers, all samples like that. If you're interested, thank you to Rob McElhenney and Ryan Reynolds, if this gets in their ear, and Hulu and FX for you letting us borrow some of Welcome to Wrexham. And of course, good old Dr. Wikipedia for giving me my information on Mr. Rogers. So thank you. Thank you. I also want to give a special shout out. Earlier this week, we soft launched this podcast concept on social media. And I want to just say thank you to all of our loved ones, me and Richie and Harrison, who shared, this project that we all feel very strongly about. And thank you for the love and support. We're going to need it along the way. And for people who've showed support who I don't know, thank you too. And we look forward to reaching as many people as possible. So as we do end every episode in the manliest way possible, we're going to put our hands in and huddle up like football practice. All right, boys, feelings on 3. 1, 2, 3. Feelings! Hit him with the outro, Richie. Peace. See you next time.